Hey, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to start the event. I know some of you are still getting food, but as you get your food, just sit down and I'm going to go through a couple pre-panel announcements. So first and foremost, if you want to get PDH credit for this event, you can scan the QR codes on your table or up on the main screen. That'll bring you to a form. And that form you can fill out and we will email you a PDH certificate after the event. We want to start by thanking our sponsors. Our tier 1 sponsors are Carrier, Con Edison, WSP, CDE, SRS. Our tier 2 sponsors are Train and the Fulcrum Group, JB&B and Johnson Controls, AKF and Siska Hennessy, Fleet, Belimo and Goldman Copeland, ADS, Chimney Design Solutions and Federal Pump. Our tier 3 sponsors are Mitsubishi Electric, National Air Filter and Vitalik, Wallace Ennis, Cerami and Siemens, Thermal System Associates, Rath Associates, and EcoCare Corp. IMI, Walls Darby, MPM Boilers. So over the next couple months, we have a bunch of designer series coming up. Great topics. The first one is February 24th, and it's going to be Psyched for Psychometrics. You can find out all of the information that I'm about to say on our website under the events tab. In March, we're going to have electrification case studies. And in April, we'll have applications of radiant heating and cooling systems in buildings. We have a bunch of YEA events coming up. The winter edition, it's a happy hour. It's going to be taking place February 22nd. It's a virtual event. YEA is also hosting an escape room on March 3rd. And we're going to have a training series at Mitsubishi Electric on March 16th. And all the information for these events are on the website. We are holding a newsletter contest to name the newsletter. You can submit your names, and if you win, you get a $200 gift card to Keen's Steakhouse. So submit those names. It takes, 10 minutes, and you could have a nice evening at Keen's Steakhouse. We're also holding an ASHRAE Scholarship Information Session on March 3rd from 6 to 8, March 30th, and you can find the information for that on our website. So our next chapter meeting in March, on March 22nd, is going to be Environmental Controls and Life Support, Designing Spaces in Outer Space. And that is going to be a really interesting event, and I recommend all of you attending that as well. And now I'd like to introduce the president of ASHRAE New York, Ben Ruddy.
Good evening, everybody. This is so exciting. I'm really happy that we were able to get back together in person, 1 month delayed from when we were supposed to do this in January. I think the last time we had you speaking here, Gina, was 2 years ago, the last in-person event that you did. So quite an honor to have her and Emily and John here for tonight's event. Can you go to the next slide, Greg? Can you go to the next one real quick? So just two things I wanted to talk about. One, we're having something called the membership battle. So members are at the heart of what we do at ASHRAE and with our chapter. So we are offering some incentives for your companies to sign up new members. So the company that signs up the most gross members, new members this spring, will get 5 free tickets to our gala. And the company that signs up the most members by percentage over existing members will also get 5 free tickets for the gala. So make sure to spread the word to your own companies, to yourselves. You can find all the information on our website. If you can go back one slide, Greg. And so before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to highlight we're bringing back our 2022 ASHRAE New York Gala. We haven't done this in a couple years since we did it at the Manhattan Car Club. For those of you who've been there, it is a fantastic event. We do have plenty of sponsorships available and tickets on sale. It's going to be a casino night. So if your company wants to sponsor a blackjack table or a poker table or a lounge or a room or an arcade game or anything like that and then support the event, we're really excited. One interesting thing is we were reading back through some of the 100-year history, and we think it could be considered that back in 1916, they hosted the beefsteak dinner at Murray's Restaurant in New York, held for the American Society of Refrigerating Engineers society-wide dinner celebration. So we think that could be considered the first gala here in New York. So quite a long tradition. And this is going to be at Gotham Hall. But not only that, I wanted to announce and let everyone know that our Distinguished Service Award winner for 2022 for ASHRAE New York will also be Gina Boker this year. So if everybody could give her a round of applause. So this is for all of her work here in New York in our space, are helping drive sustainability in our city, and for helping reshape the way that we're all going to have to design and think about the built environment moving forward. So she's the Chief Sustainability Officer for the New York City Department of Buildings, and also the chair of the Local on 97 Advisory Board, with over 25 years bringing sustainable design initiatives to the forefront. I was going to go through her whole bio, but I'll spare her we'll do that at the gala. So, but you can find the entire bio online. So I also want to introduce Emily Hoffman, who's also going to be speaking tonight. She's the Director of Energy Code Compliance for the New York City Department of Buildings, as well as a member of the ASHRAE Standards 90.1 and 229 committees, amongst other organizations. And then we also have joining us virtually, John Adario, the Director of the Division of Building Standards and Codes at the New York State Department of State, who will be speaking about the state initiatives versus the New York City initiatives here. So we're going to be covering everything from codes, energy code, from state and city to local on 97 to the natural gas ban to the future of the energy code. So should be a great event. And I also want to just a round of applause for our entire Club 101 staff for putting on such a great event for us tonight. So for all the staff here, I don't know where Alex went, but we thank them very much. And I will, and Artorius Reyes is going to be moderating the panel at the end. So I think, Greg, we can pass it to John.
Good evening. Can everybody hear me? I'm going to try to share my screen where let me see. Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me this evening. It's very nice of you to accommodate me virtually. Just a little bit about myself. My background is actually mechanical engineering. I work for a design build firm that did plan and spec and design build, and I worked there for a few years, and then I went to work for a mechanical consultant. So okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the codes division very briefly, talk a little bit about how codes are developed in New York State, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change and what the impact potentially will be on the New York State codes. And again, you probably can't see this, but the division does a lot of different things, and we do everything from variances to the uniform code. We do training for code enforcement officials. We do technical support for the uniform code and energy code. So a lot of different things. One thing that I am going to point out, in the past, we used to have an energy code years ago. Due to staffing restraints, we kind of blended all that into the other units. So the code development would work on energy, education did training on energy. So with all the push, with everything going on with the climate change and updates to the code, we've actually recreated that energy code services unit. So we are kind of putting all that function and that focus on that, and they're kind of taking the lead on anything energy code related, which is great. So I'll start in on the uniform code. So as background, we train mostly code enforcement officials throughout the state. So I like to start with this because this kind of sets the groundwork for how we have the code. And where it kind of lays. So it comes from the executive law, 377. That tells us, gives the Secretary of State the authority. It gives the Code Council the authority to do, so they're the governing agency for updating the code, the uniform code. And all that resides in Title 19 of the New York State Codes, Rules, and Regulations. So back in the day, the actual code resided in that, and we usually call it the Green Book, but it was a code, all-in-one code when it was a smaller version. As when we adopted the I codes, the model codes, we actually went and started incorporating them by reference. So now we're currently on the 2020 New York State Code. Those actually are based on the 2018 I codes. Also, just to point out that reference standards also carry the same weight as the code. So we've got, we basically call those incorporated by reference. And again, when I say uniform code, it's the building code, residential code, fire code, existing building code, property maintenance code, mechanical, fuel, gas, and plumbing. So it includes all the 8 of those. And then the energy code, obviously comes from the energy law, Article 11. That actually resides in Title 19 of the New York State Rules, Codes, Rules, and Regulations, Part 1240. And again, we incorporated those by reference. So obviously 90.1 is incorporated by reference. Carries the same weight as the New York State Code, the 2020 New York State Code. So that and we usually talk about that for code enforcement officials, because when they reference violations and stuff, they need to cite Title 19, Part 1240, or Title 19, so of Part 1220 or whatever code they're in that they would reference as far as violations. So that's important to know, because the other reason is when we actually do an interim update, it doesn't go into the code. We don't update the whole code. We actually incorporate it into, say, if it was an energy code provision, we would incorporate that change into Part 1240. And then normally that any kind of legislative change or anything like that, or interim, if we found something that really needed to be changed, it would actually go into Part 1240. So it's good to know, because when we say somebody's looking at the code, they really need to look at all 3 of these the code reference, and also the code itself plus Title 19. So and again, just showing that the governing body is the New York State Fire Prevention and Building Code Council. and we kind of call it the buildings of New York State, which includes the Energy Code and the other 8 codes. So the Uniform Code is mandatory statewide except New York City. Regarding the Energy Code is applicable for the whole state, including New York City. Local governments can adopt a more restrictive energy code, which a lot have done. They've actually done the stretch code. New York City has their own energy code. They can do that. Regarding the Uniform Code, they can apply for more restrictive local standards as far as other jurisdictions other than New York City. We call those more restrictive local standards, and those are approved by the Code Council. So, okay, so we'll get into the climate change and building codes. Now, I was told that everybody is very familiar with this, so I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on this, but I will mention that a couple of the recommendations that are coming out of the Energy Efficiency and Housing Panel. So one of the initiatives is to adopt the stretch code statewide. This is based on the 2023 version of the stretch code. So currently that version is not out yet, and NYStretch is working on that with their consultants, and it looks like it's going to be out by the end of 2022. So we would be looking at that right as after it's released. So potentially that would go into effect statewide. It would probably be 2024 if we did the rulemaking and we started, but there are a couple barriers to that, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Again, another recommendation is benchmarking on large buildings, and then energy disclosure at the sale of a building, including residential and commercial. So, electric new construction code in new homes starting in 2025. Another couple things on these, and some I'm mentioning these because there are barriers right now in both the Uniform Code slightly and the Energy Code. The Energy Law has specific requirements for payback period, and there is a 10-year payback period that the Code Council has to consider. So a lot of these are great recommendations, but we, in the past have there's barriers there. So we can't, as a state, just update the code, or the Code Council can't just update the code. There's certain things in the Energy Law and the Uniform Code Act that has to be considered when updating the code. So, and then the big one here is the require lighting upgrades to current Energy Code standards for buildings, greater than 25,000 square feet. Then again, I think everybody here is probably a lot more familiar with this than I am. But the A2Ls, there's a big push for those. Right now, currently the state code, there are barriers in there. We've been watching the 2021. There were a lot of proposals as far as the model code for updating that. And I have been told that the 2024 removed some of those barriers in the code. So we may be looking as a state, looking at those provisions and incorporating them into the state code. And again, if anybody doesn't know this, the Climate Action Council scoping plan is now out. They are actually looking for public comments, and it actually came out on January 1st. There's a 120-day public comment period, and I've got the links here. I can share them with you if via email if you want. But they are looking for comments on that, and so I believe they're going to schedule a few public hearings, either virtually or in person, to hear some of those public comments. So a little bit more recently, in the State of the State, the governor made some announcements. of initiatives, and I think one of the bigger ones was the goal, setting a goal of 2 million climate-friendly electrified or electrification-ready homes by 2030. Right now, there is a plan between a couple of the agencies to actually look at this and figure out a plan how to do this and what the criteria will be. But obviously, some of this stuff is overlapping with what the Climate Action Council recommendations are. So we've got kind of a few balls in the air juggling to try to do the next update to the code. And then a couple other things that were mentioned: the energy benchmarking for large buildings. It looks very familiar to what was the recommendations from the Climate Action Council. But still there's still, this doesn't remove the barriers that we still have, and I'll talk a little bit about the proposed legislation that will kind of remove some of those barriers later on. And again, that right here is the announcement that the update to the building code cost-effective criteria to account for the full lifetime of the installed equipment. So this is basically taking out the 10-year payback requirement and adding in a life cycle cost analysis in the energy law, which will allow the code council to update the state code and not be restrained to the 10-year payback. And then a couple other things was to include NYStretch in the code council. So right now the code council is made up of 17 members, various different size municipalities, and also there's an engineer, architect, code official. So all those are covered. So they're actually adding 2 more seats to the code council to make it 19. And again, these are proposals. These have not, none of this stuff has actually passed legislation, but they're proposed. And again, there was a legislation out there that was called the Advanced Energy Code and Appliance Standard, doing very similar stuff. Some of this was actually in the budget bill, so it's kind of coming at it at a different angle. But depending on which legislation gets passed, but I think the goal is all the same: is to allow the code council, the ability to update the energy code and the uniform code to cover some of the climate issues that we're seeing now. So real quick, as far as rule making in New York State, we actually send out a bulletin that keeps code officials, any interested party, up to date. We actually just sent one out on grease traps. There was legislation that was passed and has been or will be shortly signed by the governor, and that actually changed some of the requirements for grease traps. So we do like to send bulletins out to code officials, keep them updated, or any interested party on what's going on. So I'm going to give a link in a minute as far as how to sign up for those. And we also have another outreach program, which has been a great success. It started in a few years ago, and each month we send out a bulletin, and we try to cover a specific topic each month based on feedback we get from code officials. And we usually, it's a one-page document. We post it on our website, but we send it out. There's about 50 now that we kind of keeps, it's hot topics that we see, or something that may need clarification. So we send those bulletins out monthly. And I'm going to give you a link that shows where you can sign up. So right here, it's if you go to our main page, you can go to Building Standards and Codes. It's a drop down, and then right at the bottom of the page are the links to sign up for these. We don't send a lot out. We just when it's necessary, and usually it's a cop once a month, and then the bulletin is usually when there's a scheduled code council meeting. Try to include what the agenda is, what they would be covering, and then also any rule makings that we do, or rule and development. So when we're working on something, drafting the rule, we usually like to share it to get feedback as, once we get a certain point in the draft regulations, we like to send it out. So it's not a formal process, but before we get to that, we like to do outreach. I think that is it. So, well, thank you very much, and I'm really appreciate you setting this up so I could attend virtually.
Good. John, thank you. We do have a Q&A session coming up at the end. Since we're running a little bit behind, let's just move quickly on to Emily coming next, and we'll have some more questions. So, Emily?
All right, thank you, Artorias. And thank you to the New York City ASHRAE chapter for having us here today. Make sure I have the... All right, I'm Emily Hoffman. I'm the Director of Energy Code Compliance at the New York City Department of Buildings. I lead the team that enforces the Energy Code and develops the Energy Code, and does everything Energy Code related as far as enforcement. So today I'm going to talk to you about just see if I can remember off the top of my head. And I guess I should just say I'm also heavily, not just in New York City, but heavily involved in the Energy Code development at the national level, both on ASHRAE committees with 90.1, trying to streamline energy modeling processes with 229, and also on the ICC, the IECC commercial side. So my world is Energy Code. And before I joined the department 8 years ago, I was an energy modeler, also did energy auditing and commissioning. Let's see, is this working? I'm not sure this is working, unless it's me.
There we go.
All right, thank you. Okay, so today I'm just going to go over quickly, the current Energy Code went into effect almost 2 years ago now. So I'm just going to quickly go over some of the high level changes where it differs from the state, and just going to talk through just compliance issues that we see, common errors and things like that. Very high level since, this has been in effect for 2 years. But then I also want to touch on what the future energy codes will look like and when we expect them to be, coming into effect next. I'm also going to talk about a pilot program that we did in New York City and hope to inspire all of you to sign up and participate. And then I'll pass it off to Gina, and Gina will talk about the new Electrification Law and Local Law 97. All right, so like I said, the Energy Code went into effect May 12th of 2020, which John talked to us about. And in New York City, we're also required, we're mandated by law to adopt the NYStretch Code. So we did in New York, and we just incorporated it into the New York City Code. So the New York City 2020 Energy Code includes the provisions of the Stretch Code. We have an advisory committee that we should be launching later this year. If any of you are interested in participating on that, we go through a process with stakeholder group and figure out where the code needs to change, where we need to amend it, keeping in mind that we have to adopt the Stretch Code and we have to adopt the state code. So we can't be less stringent than either one. But we do make a lot of modifications. So very high level, just going to talk about some of the big items that came through on the Stretch Code. I know most of you here are engineers and feel like maybe this doesn't apply, but we made a lot of changes to the envelope this time, which does in turn affect sizing of equipment. So just keeping that in mind. Some of the, the insulation requirements became more stringent. That was the first time in a while in a few code cycles that happened. And there's also now mandatory thermal breaks for balconies and parapets. So, we either have to wrap it or you have to, provide a thermal break. You can still use ComCheck or energy modeling, don't have to do that, but You can trade it off, I mean. But these things all improve the envelope and you should be able to downsize your equipment. We're also requiring air barrier commissioning and air barrier testing on a lot more buildings. So any building 10,000 square feet and greater has to go through this exercise. So in turn, and this is a little bit more difficult to capture, but in turn it should make the building more comfortable, less leaky, and your HVAC system should, in turn work less. The stretch code also introduced, I guess the thing that we're running into with the energy code is we're getting to the point of diminishing returns. So we see a lot of scope creep, I should say. There's a lot more things that are becoming regulated in the energy code that weren't regulated previously. So that unregulated loads is becoming a larger portion of the energy pie than it was in the past. And things like elevators and commercial kitchen equipment are now becoming regulated in the energy code. So for new elevators, only in high where they go over 7 stories, those are now regulated in the energy code and require generative drives. Certain commercial kitchen equipment has to follow the performance requirements of Energy Star. So this was just stuff that wasn't regulated before. And then for lighting, we had a major reduction in lighting power densities, right, which also in turn affects the sizing of HVAC equipment. More spaces require occupancy sensors. So, it's very clear now that corridor lighting has to be on an occupancy sensor. Open plan offices, before it was just enclosed offices, must have occupancy sensors. Also, certain, food area, cafeterias and fast food. I think the stretch code also, we were debating for a while on including dining halls and decided to take that out. So it's just cafeteria and fast food. And then if, this was a big difference before with the ICC and ASHRAE. Those are, alternative pathways you can use for energy code compliance. If you follow the energy code, the ECC, which is based on the ICC, there was a section that said, you follow the code and you get to this section and you can choose a high efficiency option. It's a mandatory choice. It's a choice, but it's still mandatory that you choose a high efficiency option. So you could do high efficiency lighting, high efficiency HVAC, better performing envelope. And that wasn't required if you follow the ASHRAE path. But this code now, this version of the code now requires that high efficiency option when following ASHRAE. So that's important to note. And then we get to energy modeling. Do we have any energy modelers in here? I'll see how long to spend on this topic. All right, a few. So we saw some major changes to the energy modeling pathway. Most notably is what we call an envelope backstop. So before this code came into effect, you could trade off the envelope with HVAC and lighting just until the numbers worked out. There was no limit to what you could trade off. And most of the modeling that we see, when we see a project that does energy modeling, it's usually because of a highly glazed building, right? They can't comply with ComCheck. But what this says is you can still trade off the envelope, but you can only trade off to a certain limit. So for multifamily, you can only be 15% worse than the prescriptive requirements in the code. For office, you can only be 7% worse than the prescriptive requirements of the code. So it still allows for highly glazed buildings, but it does set a performance limit. So we've been, we track this at the department, and this is data that feeds into our next code cycle, so we can start changing those numbers based on real buildings. So if you do energy modeling, you have to submit energy modeling reports, your EN1 form, and a ComCheck report. So there's a specific ComCheck report that's now required for doing energy modeling to make sure you're meeting this envelope backstop. And then another important addition was that in the past, energy modeling was only based on energy cost, right? It was the annual energy cost was your metric for comparing your building to the code building. But the stretch code introduced another metric, which was source energy. So we think this is, this was a really important change, and I think we can expect in the next versions of the code to be moving away from cost much more, especially with the introduction of Local Law 97 and using carbon equivalence as a metric. Do we have any residential engineers in here? Does anyone design residential homes? One person? Okay. Yeah, I figured that wasn't quite this crowd, but I just wanted to throw this in here anyways, because the Energy Code requires balanced mechanical ventilation in homes or energy recovery. So you either have to install an energy, you have to design your ventilation system with an energy recovery system, or you have to have supply and exhaust, and it has to be balanced. It also has to be tested, so it's almost like commissioning light for these homes. So that's a really big change that we're seeing for 1 and 2 family homeowners. Also, all ducts must be within conditioned space. So ignore what this photo looks like down at the bottom. Is the best one I can find, but that's no longer allowed. You can't put your ducts in an unconditioned attic anymore. It has to all be in conditioned space. And then the third major change that happened in the residential code was that all parking spaces must be electric vehicle ready or capable. You don't have to install an electric vehicle charger, but I think we'll hold questions till the end. However, it does have to have the capability to install a charger. So you have to have the conduit, the panel space, or an outlet. So that's also a major change. And that all came from the stretch code, right? So our local Energy Code Advisory Committee didn't come up with these ideas. This was all at the stretch code. The next few code changes came from our advisory committee. So in the envelope, we saw that the stretch code was increasing the insulation values, and our local committee decided to make the fenestration more stringent. And we realized that, we talked to some manufacturers and realized that at the height of 95 feet on the elevation of a building is when you need a lot more structural support. So we have more stringent requirements for fenestration that's on the building, but less than 95 feet in elevation. And then above 95 feet in elevation, it's a little more, it's less stringent than, that 95-foot demarcation. We have a lookup table now for spandrel panel assemblies. We had a really tough time, really pinpointing what the U factor of those were. So now we just have like a quick lookup table for designers. Like I mentioned before, we expanded the air barrier testing requirements. That's blower door testing. It's required on all buildings greater than 10,000 square feet. And this is, tying into our next code, but we require documentation on thermal bridges. I won't get into that a lot here, but we just require documentation. But, the stretch code is leaning towards next code cycle requiring, that to be taken, any thermal bridging to be taken into account in the analysis of the envelope. So that could be a major change in, thinking about how you design the HVAC system when you actually start accounting for all of this thermal bridging. As far as, straight in the HVAC section, there weren't too many changes that we made. One was that we just always update the minimum efficiency to the federal minimum. By the time the code goes into effect, it's a few years since it was passed. So we just make sure we're, in line with the federal standards. And like I mentioned before, there's an additional efficiency option, mandatory option. We took out renewable energy. So that's because we have a new law in New York that in New York City, you have to install solar or green roof. So you don't get credit for that anymore in the energy code. You have to do something else. Also, this came from our advisory committee that, we were seeing a lot, my team was seeing a lot on plan examination that condensing boilers that were, being designed in buildings were not operating in condensing mode. So that was a change that was made in the code. So it doesn't mandate that you have a condensing boiler, and this probably goes away with the new electrification law, but for gas-fired boilers, if the designer chooses to have a condensing boiler, it must be designed to operate in the condensing mode. And then, for the people that design residential under the Residential Energy Code, we found that, multifamily buildings less than 3 stories, single family home buildings, group R3. If they're greater than 4 stories, they fall under the commercial code. If they're less than 4 stories, they fall under residential. So we just tried to align them a little bit more. So if you're designing a townhouse now that's like 4 stories tall, you fall under commercial code. I think the big change here is that you now have to do the balanced ventilation or provide energy recovery. So you also have to do air leakage testing, provide permanent certificate. But I think the big thing there is the ventilation requirement. So did I run through those too fast? So those are the highlights of the code. I think most of you might know them already. But I want to spend a little more time on what the future of the energy code looks like. So who here is familiar with Local Law 32? Does that ring a bell for anyone? No? Okay, so Local Law 32 of 2018, a few years ago, this is the law that says we have to adopt the stretch code. So it said we had to adopt the stretch code in New York City in 2019. We were a little bit delayed on that. We always have to time our energy code adoption with the state. So that's why it went into effect in 2020. It also says we have to adopt the next version of the stretch code in 2022. So it's looking like it probably won't be 2022. It'll probably be 2023. Gina and I are participating on the advisory committee right now. It's going on right now for the stretch code. So we see what's coming. And the stretch code is looking really stringent. They just increased the targets to be, they're calling it zero ready, that it'll be a zero ready code. So it's very aggressive, which is why it's being a little bit delayed. And so, we're working hard with them to try to make sure that it's, what we get is a good product, because we know we have to adopt it in New York City. So that's coming soon. And then in 2025, which we can assume will probably be 2026-ish, this law says we have to have a performance-based code. And so what it specifically says is that we have to have a code that has a predicted energy use, and it's on a to be determined metric. So it doesn't specify what the metric is, which is good. So we can figure out how we're going to align what Gina will talk about next. So lots of exciting things happening here. I have one more slide. This in 2020, the performance-based code in 2025, 2026. One of our concerns was that we don't want to see every project have to do traditional energy modeling, right? That's a huge burden on the industry, a huge burden on the department to review all of that. And we want to, we just don't want to create, barriers. We want to build good buildings. We don't just want paperwork. So, so this is what, I hope all of you will be inspired to join. We've been doing a performance pilot program with PNNL, Pacific Northwest National Lab. It's funded by Department of Energy. We did a phase 1 in the fall last year, and it was successful. We learned a lot, and so we're going into a phase 2 in the spring of 2022. So shortly we'll be looking for participants. And what we're trying to do here is to develop a performance-based code that meets the intent of Local Law 32, but that's also more usable for the majority of the industry. And so it's what we're calling like a systems-based performance. So energy modeling is whole building performance. It's looking at trading off, the performance of an envelope with HVAC and lighting. This is looking at envelope specifically, HVAC specifically, lighting specifically, right? And making sure that they meet certain performance targets for each one of those systems. what the big difference here is this TSPR tool for HVAC. It's based on asset score that PNNL has developed, and that's the tool that we really need a lot of feedback and input from. It's like energy modeling light. It's kind of a drag and drop type tool, but it does do an energy model in this tool. So we got a lot of feedback on that. We need more feedback. So, you know, we hope that you will participate. And if you're interested, send an email and we'll take your info and let you know when it starts again. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Gina.
Thank you, Emily. So we indulge me to recognize a few people in the room. If you participated in our Energy Code Advisory Committee or in a local on 97 working group or phase 1 of the pilot that Emily just described, please stand up or raise your hand. Or thank you, because we do not do this work by ourselves. And we really appreciate the support that we get from the industry on these initiatives and the work that we're doing. And it's really a great pleasure to work with Emily on all that stuff anyway. So I'm Gina Bokra, and I am an architect that somehow got into the room. My father wanted me to be an engineer, and I didn't listen to him. And I should have maybe. So I'm Chief Sustainability Officer at the department. I've spent my entire career on sustainability and energy, just like Emily has as well. And she was modest and forgot to mention that she's a rock star. So I wanted to talk about our new electrification law, because this obviously changes some of the things that we're doing at the department. And I wanted to point out that the law passed, it's kind of lives in two places. So it's important to recognize the first place where it lives is Title 24, which is our air pollution control code in New York City, because carbon dioxide is a pollutant. So we need to have the authority to control that and regulate it. So that gives us the ability to regulate those emissions. And then the rest of it lives in our construction codes and the administrative code. So if you're looking for the two different pieces, this sets the limits in the Title 24, which is DEP's air code. That's where the limit lives. And then sort of the scope of, you know, what buildings are affected, that is in DOB's code. And that was local law 154 of 2021. So what the law does is it sets a limit of 25 kilograms of CO2 per million BTU. And so to put that into context, for natural gas, it's 53 kilograms. And why do we leave some in there? Well, it's not zero, it's 25, anticipating that sometime in the future, we're going to have low carbon fuels out there that are available. So that leaves a little bit of flexibility in the future for what we might be able to do in buildings someday with a different type of energy system out there. And so the scope, we're talking about new construction. So let's start with the easiest buildings first. So there's a phase in, and the buildings that are smaller, low-rise buildings under 7 stories, they will be subject to this beginning January 1st, 2024. So that's not very far into the future, especially if you're looking at, you know, 1, 2, 3 family homes. This is coming up really soon. So that if you remember the timeline that John was sharing with what the state has set, it's a little faster than what the state is setting just for those smaller buildings. And then the timeline for buildings 7 stories and over, which are, we all know, are more complicated when it comes to electrification, that's July 1st, 2027. That's the same year that the state has set, but we may have some resolution to work out between those two laws. And now I want to point out that the law also created an exception, and there are several. So for buildings that are less than 7 stories, with the exception of 1, 2, 3 family homes, you can still use natural gas in those buildings for hot water systems up until that July 1, 2027 deadline. So those smaller buildings, that exception goes away in 2027. So there were stakeholders that said, we're like multifamily buildings, hot water systems are still really hard to electrify. It doesn't pan out. The cost is not really what we need it to be. So we'll see how the market changes, and that's how they responded in the law. And I want to point out a section that it's important to be aware of, because some alterations to buildings could end up triggering this law. And so there's a section in the Administrative Code, section 101.4.5. And this is a section that says if you've increased the horizontal surface in your existing building by a certain amount, I think it's 110%, then you're a new building. So if you go in and you remove floors, you remove a roof, you add a floor, you take out the basement and you add a new cellar and a basement, you could have to file with the department as a new building, and that would mean that you're also subject to this law. So, and I put a reference to the bulletin that helps you determine whether a project has slipped into that category. All right, what are the other exceptions? Well, affordable housing, they were a little nervous about this. So they have a slightly different timeline. So you can see it depends on how much of the building is dedicated to affordable units. If it's 50% or more and the building is under 7 stories, then you essentially get another 2 years before you have to comply with this law. If it's 50% of the units are affordable and it's 7 stories or more, then you have until January 1st, 2028. So you only get an extra 6 months than the rest of the industry for those larger buildings. What are the other exceptions? Buildings regulated for energy generation. So our friends at Con Ed, they create a new plant and it's natural gas burning plant. That's not subject to this law. And then buildings operated by a DP for sewage or food waste treatment, those are exempt as well. And buildings constructed by the School Construction Authority, they also have a different timeline. Most of those buildings are probably going to be under the 7 stories, so they're essentially getting an extra year. And these are the other important exceptions to be aware of. So in the law, it says if fossil fuels necessary for a manufacturing use or purpose, and then it lists these specifically as examples: laboratories, laundromats, hospitals, crematoria, commercial kitchens, and I think we have to think about what was the intent of the law there, and then emergency and standby power in buildings. So obviously these are uses that we need to be very energy intensive and have the right fuel source for those. So we'll be supporting this law with additional information from the department over time, and keep your eye out for that. It's also important to recognize that the law requires the city to do some studies. We're starting off with new buildings. We know over time we need all buildings to electrify. How do we get there? And so before we can figure out what other legislation might be necessary, we're going to be doing a study of how we electrify low-rise and high-rise buildings in the city. And then it also called for the city to do a study of grid reliability and resiliency, which is an issue that comes up in all of our local Law 97 discussions. So we're really excited about this, and looking forward to, again, putting some more information out there on the electrification law. New York City was the first major municipality with a cold climate to do this, so I know City Council is really proud of it. Next, I wanted to share some Local Law 97 updates. And before I get into the details, I do want to point out that in the past 2 years, Emily and I have done an incredibly detailed presentation on the 2020 Energy Code, and it is available on our website as a recording. So you want more detail than what Emily shared tonight, you can go on our website and find that presentation. And the same thing for Local Law 97. Earlier this year, we did a presentation on updates to Local Law 97. Lots of detail that I'm not going to go into tonight. So there's more resources on our website. So please take a look. So I just wanted to talk about what's happened since this law passed in 2019. We've been busy. We haven't been sitting around doing nothing. We have an advisory board that's mandated by the law. It's supported by working groups. And I wanted to talk about what they've been discussing, look at the topics that are sort of high priority, and then what other things are they talking about to support Local Law 97. So the advisory board was, again, mandated in the law that we had to go through this process. There were some, I don't know how to describe them other than some fill in the blanks in the law. And I'm really grateful that City Council didn't button everything up. And keep in mind that 2 months after Local Law 97 passed, we got the CLCPA at the state, which changed the game a lot. So thank goodness we have this advisory board looking at all of these issues in the context of what is happening at the state. And those two laws are very aligned, but they're not perfectly lockstep. So these are the types of appointees. There are 16 appointees, 8 from the mayor's office, 8 from city council, a representative from each of those. And then I chair this wonderful group of people who are giving us an enormous amount of time to help us figure out how we implement this law well. They are supported by 8 different working groups. So you can see the types of groups that we have here. We have around 160 stakeholders involved right now. We're going to be adding a few more to talk about some things that we haven't gotten to. So there's a lot of different perspectives coming together to think about how we implement the law. Some really high priority things for the board to give us feedback on are issues that we have to address in rulemaking before the end of this year. So you look at this screen, you can be guaranteed that we're going to be seeing new information on this coming out sometime later this year. One of the things that we're looking at is what the coefficient should be for the different types of energy that are used in a building for the future. So we're taking a step back and trying to understand what's our future energy grid going to look like, and how does that affect the calculations that owners are doing to comply with this law. We're also looking at the greenhouse gas limits for the future. So if you're familiar with Local Law 97, we have a compliance period of 2024 to 2029. And then when we get to 2030, all those limits drop. We get to 2035, all those limits are going to drop. And so we're on that trajectory of trying to get to an 80% reduction by 2050, and we have to adjust down each of those compliance periods. So we want to help owners understand what those limits are going to look like beyond 2029. And the law says what they look like between 2030 to 2034, but in the context of the CLCPA and our changing grid, we need to reevaluate what those limits are going to look like. And then we're also, again, looking at those GHG limits, or coefficients for out into the future. So, and how do things like distributed energy resources come into play there? So all of those things will be addressed by rulemaking before the end of this year, which means we'll probably start putting information out there towards late summer, so that that will be something you can learn about. There's a public hearing process, and all of that will be then in rulemaking by the end of the year. But there's a lot of other stuff. that we have not pinned down completely in Local Law 97. So some of the topics that the working groups are looking at is how owners are going to be, impacted by the decisions that their tenants are making, and how do they change the negotiate the agreements that they have, so that there's some responsibility for everybody under Local Law 97. The law asks us to look at what the metrics are, and Emily talked about that with the Energy Code, and we're having those discussions in 97 too. Right now we have a greenhouse gas limit, and that's the only metric that we're looking at. And there's a lot of discussion about whether we need metrics that really push energy efficiency more strongly. We're discussing alternative compliance paths, things like how are we crediting renewable energy credits, and are we going to have a carbon trading system in New York? There's a study, so you can go onto the city's website, find that study, which was done by NYU, and review that. As I mentioned, what the GHG limits are going to look like for future years. Local Law 87, already 10 years old. We know we need to change that and update it with Local Law 97. And achieving more reductions from hospital buildings and really high energy intensive buildings. Also, what other kinds of incentives we can build into the law. So also looking at how do all of the Energy Star portfolio manager property types map to the 10 limits in the law. Right now we're using building code occupancy groups, and that doesn't have anything to do with energy. So that's a change that's going to be coming that adds a lot more rigor and hopefully some more equity to how those limits work. We're also looking at what the reporting requirements are going to be for buildings that are subject to Article 321, which is prescriptive requirements for rent regulated buildings. We're looking at the complexity of campuses. Most campuses are reported as if they were all one big building. And then looking at what other deductions are available to owners. Again, renewable energy certificates, how do they count? And what kind of GHG offsets should we allow owners to get credit for? So there really is a lot going on with Local Law 97, and I hope you'll pay attention to what's coming out of the department. We've already issued a couple of rules. We've issued a bulletin about how you account for EV charging, which we don't want to count against an owner, obviously. And so there will be more information coming, and we hope to hear from you in those processes. And I think that we are going to move to Q&A.
Gina, Emily, thank you. John, thank you as well. Greg, do you want to just pivot the camera over to them? Oh. All right, we've got about 20 more minutes before our time is done. So we're going to go through Q&A. Ground rules for Q&A is you're not allowed to ask project-specific questions. You're allowed to ask application and clarifications, but no specific buildings or projects for anyone. I've got the first question is actually a two-part question for both John and Gina. And the question is, the Advanced Building Codes Appliance Equipment Efficiency Standards Act of 2021 is a proposed bill being considered by legislators now. That bill looks to elevate the appliance and energy efficiency standards across the states and will authorize Code Council to incorporate GHG emissions reduction standards into building codes. Can you talk about what that means? What is the impact? What barriers it removes on the state side for John? And for Gina, what does that mean for New York City? What does New York City have to do if those barriers get removed and that starts to come into play? John?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll start. So that proposed legislation removes the barriers of the 10-year payback. Also removes or actually updates some of the requirements for historic buildings and it removes a lot of exceptions that were included in the law that we are pretty much, have to comply with. So it doesn't actually force the code council to do anything. It just will allow them to update the code and kind of try to meet those state goals for climate change.
Thank you, John. And Gina?
So I think that, again, we're looking into a crystal ball, and to John's point, we don't know what is going to get legislated. But right now we have a law in New York City that says we have to have this performance-based energy code 2025, and that's for buildings 25,000 square feet and over. And then I'm assuming if we see the state move forward on that Climate Action Council recommendation that we have a stretch code statewide. Local Law 85 of 2009 said, okay, well, New York City has to have their own code, which means it has to be more stringent than New York State's. We get into this situation where there's only so much we can change. It may not be something that New York City really can do anymore.
Right.
If we've pushed far enough at the state, then trying to go much farther will be really, really difficult.
Thank you. All right, now we'll take some questions from the audience. Any questions? I see one, Mike in the back. Oh, no.
Thank you. For the future energy code, is there going to be any limitation on electric resistance?
That came up in our last code advisory, during our discussions. And at that time, we decided people weren't using electric resistance as the main heating source. It was just too costly to operate. But I'm sure that question will come up again, especially now that we have this electrification law. So that's a very good question. And, we definitely take the advice from our engineering community on what we should do.
Then next we got John.
I just had a question on that one slide you were showing. You showed a slide that said all ducts, I guess that was supply ducts, have to be run in the conditioned space.
Yes.
Does that mean like rooftop units that are horizontal, no little bit of
Keep in mind, this is residential provisions only, not commercial. So yes, all ducts on resident that follow under the residential provisions have to be in conditioned space. That's correct.
So no little bit of duct work out on the roof.
That's correct.
That's correct.
All right, I got another question for the panel. John, can you kind of delineate where does state code apply and where does city code apply? Because I know it's a little bit tricky. I know it's easy to say the 5 boroughs, but can you give us a little guidance in terms of where each code applies? Because there's always some confusion around that.
Sure. So the Uniform Code and based on the executive law, it says it applies across the state except in municipalities greater than 1 million, which would obviously apply to New York City. With some exceptions, a building built or is in custody of a state agency would be built to the Uniform Code, and in some cases they do choose to comply with the New York City. So that's the Uniform Code. As far as the Energy Code, the Energy Code is applicable statewide, except local governments are allowed to adopt a more restrictive local energy code, and there actually has been a lot of local governments that have done that now. There's a push for stretch. In New York City, obviously, adopted a more restrictive code. There's several local governments that have done that. So the only thing I would say is, other than regarding the energy code, you would enter any local government as far as the Uniform Code and Energy Code. I would still go to the local government if you're building a building and actually see if they're using any either Uniform Code requirements that are more restrictive, or the Energy Code that may be based on the stretch code.
Thank you for that, John. Any other questions from the audience?
I have a question. just want to say I really enjoyed the presentation. But my question was on the New York City Electrification Law. Would a building with a cogeneration plant or say university with a campus plant be considered an exception under the regulated utility exception?
That's a good question. This is on. Can you hear me? I think under the intent of the law, you would not be able to install a new system. It doesn't apply to existing right now. So those cogen plants that are out there, they're good for a while. We don't know how long, but you know, owners that are looking at a new cogen system would have to do it in the next few years.
Thank you.
Yep.
How we doing? In regards to envelope commissioning, is there any, are you looking into a certain standard to define the scope of envelope commissioning besides it just being a requirement?
That's also a very good question. We've had many debates on this, and you know, the problem with envelope commissioning is there's not just a national standard yet, right? There's several different, you know, several different standards that you could look to, and so we just define it loosely in the code now as an approved, and I think we say an approved engineering standard. So it'd be something that the design professional decides this is a standard they choose, and then follow that intent.
Thank you. Great presentation. So earlier when, before the law was completely done, there was some discussion of major alterations that eventually got dropped. So updates to the existing building code or retroactive equipments, because like most buildings in New York are already built, right?
So yeah, an earlier version of the bill applied to major alterations, which isn't really defined well in the code. And we don't have an existing building code in New York City yet, even though there's one in development. So the cleanest way to address that was that Chapter 3 code section that I referred to that says, okay, if you've increased your horizontal surface of your building by 110%, then you're a new building. So we capture a lot of major renovations that come through the department because they get caught in that new building status as when they file. It doesn't capture all of them, but we didn't want to capture those buildings where somebody's renovating their kitchen and they're renovating another kitchen in another part of the building they're doing. So it's really hard to capture those small renovations that might be major, but might not be major. That was the cleanest approach. However, that study that is going to be done, I'm sure that's going to be the primary focus, is how do we capture those other buildings that are going to be making modifications where electrification really makes a lot of sense at that point. So, next year, hopefully we'll see a really good plan come out of that study. And then in addition, I would point back to what John had shared coming from the state, saying at some point there may be a deadline where you cannot replace gas-fired equipment in kind anymore. And so right now the CAC said, okay, 2030, that's your cutoff. After that point, you've got to figure something else out. So we'll see what happens with that legislation. The city might consider something similar.
Any other questions from the audience?
I've got one.
We've got one. I don't think you need a mic.
I haven't heard any discussion or very little about enforcement of these new provisions and penalties in case you don't live up to it. And there is some enforcement. Can I hear some discussion about that?
Sure. I lead a team that does enforcement of the Energy Code, and so currently you cannot receive approval or a permit in the city of New York for new buildings or major alterations without going through the Energy Code review process and demonstrating compliance. We also have inspectors that go on site. We also have a team that audits third-party inspectors that are required on every project, every construction project in the city that has to comply with the energy code. So we have a robust enforcement program on the energy code side. You know, when the electrification law goes into effect, a lot of that will tie into our team. And so we'll be adjusting what we look at, what are the high impact items. And, you know, we do that regularly, you know, depending on, you know, the new provisions in the code, and we're always adjusting our enforcement practices. And we do have penalties. I don't know them off the top of my head, but our inspectors have energy code specific violations. So they can go on site if they see something is not compliant with energy code, they can write a violation. There is a fee, and it has to get remedied. So that's on the energy code side. And then local law 97 has, you know, Gina could speak to that, but there's very steep fines for non-compliance with local law 97.
I have a question. Over in the corner. Will the fees be progressive or are they static? Like it'll be one single fee? Like say you have multiple violations of the same thing over a period of time. How does that change?
It is. We have class 1, 2, and 3 violations. It depends on the severity of the violation. And I think also the extent of time and when it has not been remedied.
And the other effective things that we have are you can't get your C of O if you have an outstanding violation on an energy code item. And if we find that an approved agent is signing off on things that we know are not happening on jobs, we eliminate their ability to file in the city of New York, go work somewhere else. So we have mechanisms in place. Some of those are, you know, we have to build a really strong case against a professional if they're not doing the right thing.
Any more questions from the audience? All right, I actually have one more, if I can. The question is, it could be for either John or Gina, depending on who answers it better. New York City, New York City can update to the latest stretch code, but New York State can't. Can we talk about why is that? Why does New York City have that ability to update its own code to a higher level, but New York State can, even though they want to, given the CLCPA, right? So can you give us some context on that? I don't know who wants to take that, either John or Gina, whichever one.
I can start, and then Gina can correct me. No. Yeah, and I mentioned the energy law before. That was written, the statewide energy code went into effect in '79, and a lot of that law comes, and a lot of the things that are in there are outdated. There's been some updates, but basically the co-council needs to look at the 10-year payback. So there's stretch code right now. Goes beyond that. So when they look at that, they have to consider that. So that's a barrier. And I think the way that originally the energy code or the energy law was written, I think it kind of gave, you know, local governments the ability to have something more restrictive. And essentially they submit that to the co-council. The co-council doesn't necessarily have to or is required to approve it. They only take action if they find that it's less restrictive than the state code. So, Gina, do you want to, anything you want to add?
I think I'll only add, John, because you've explained it. New York City isn't bound by that 10-year payback criteria, and we don't have to go through that process. We absolutely consider cost effectiveness of every provision that we change. Sometimes that's supported by additional research. When the stretch code was developed, they did a cost analysis and carefully considered what is the economic impact to going with these code revisions. but we're not held to the same restrictions that the state has to deal with. So it's really important that we see that change happen at the state that is proposed right now, and give the state some ability to innovate and push things farther than they've been able to in the past.
All right, well, thank you for that. This is a little farther away. Thank you for the answers, and to our panel, thank everyone. I would say thank our panel. We are almost at time now, so a couple quick announcements. Michael, you want to come up and give the YA announcement?
Yes. All right. Stepping this off. So after everyone is chit-chatted and networked, we'll be holding a YEA happy hour at Peter Dillon's around the corner. Luke and Ellie will be, if they could raise their hands, over by the exit. They will be leading everyone over there. Please feel free to join. It's going to be a good time. I don't know what the panelists plan to do, but they are also invited to our happy hour. So thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed the event. We'll have it posted online for review or for viewing in a couple days, maybe a week. Again, just want to thank the panelists and the staff at Club 101. They did an amazing job, and hope to see you next month.
Just again, if you need PDH, just use the QR code in here. I know it says the wrong event. We did a lot, but we didn't print the new sheets out. So just use the QR code that's on here. And then some of the slides that were presented tonight, I believe it's mostly public information, so we can share the slides. We'll get them posted. Make sure to subscribe to the ASHRAE New York YouTube channel to get the recordings, and then we will get the slides sent out with your PDH certificates as long as you fill out the QR code, and then to everybody else who signed up. So appreciate everyone coming, and see you tonight and next month.
Last announcement. The second QR code on the pamphlets, as well as up here, is our presentation evaluation. It lets you rate our presentations. It helps us pick speakers in the future, and we would appreciate if you fill it out. For all the online participants, it'll actually be emailed to you, both the PDH request form and the presentation evaluation. So fill those out, and we can have a great rest of the year of presentations, as well as into the 2022-23 year. Thank you.